Every time taxes on the wealthy come up, the same warning shows up right behind it. Be careful, or the rich will leave. They'll take their money, their companies, their jobs, and their tax dollars with them. It sounds logical. It sounds scary. And it sounds like one of those things nobody is allowed to question. But the more you look at how people actually choose where to live, work, and build their lives, the stranger that story starts to feel. Because here's the real question: do wealthy people actually choose where to live the way the internet talks about it? Do they wake up, compare tax rates on a spreadsheet, and move to whichever place lets them keep the biggest slice of income? Or is that just a clean, simple story we tell ourselves because it sounds like economics, even if it misses how human beings actually behave? That is what this video is really about. Not whether taxes matter at all. They do. Not whether some rich people move. They do. The deeper question is whether tax policy really works like a panic button. Raise taxes, and the wealthy disappear. Lower them, and they stay. Because if that were true, then the richest and most powerful cities in the world should be emptying out every time taxes rise. And yet, many of them are still full of money, power, business opportunity, and very rich people who apparently still decided to stay. So maybe this is not just a tax story. Maybe this is a story about how people actually make decisions when money, status, family, power, and identity are all mixed together. The first thing we need to separate is possibility from probability. Yes, a wealthy person can move more easily than most people. They can hire lawyers, tax planners, relocation specialists, and private bankers. They can buy property in another state or another country. They can split time between multiple homes. They can structure their life in ways most people simply cannot. But being able to move is not the same thing as wanting to move. That difference matters a lot. Because in public debate, we often talk about the rich as if they are pure financial calculators, as if they have no habits, no emotional attachments, no routines, no favorite places, no old friends, no family obligations, no identity tied to a city or a country, as if they are just spreadsheets in human form. But real life does not work like that. A wealthy founder in New York may complain endlessly about taxes, but their investors are there, their lawyers are there, their media access is there, their network is there, and half the people who can accelerate their next deal are only a few subway stops or car rides away. Leaving is possible, but leaving also means giving up frictionless access to the machine that helped make them rich in the first place. The same goes for family life. If your children are settled in schools, your parents live nearby, your social world is built around one city, and your reputation is tied to one ecosystem, the decision to leave becomes much more than a tax decision. It becomes a life decision. And once we see that, the whole story becomes more complicated, because now the question is no longer, can rich people leave? The real question becomes, what would they have to give up if they did? The second thing people miss is that wealthy people do not just live somewhere. They are usually plugged into something. A place like New York is not just a place with apartments and restaurants. It is a machine for deal flow. London is not just a city. It is a financial network. Silicon Valley is not just geography. It is concentrated access to talent, capital, institutions, and information. And that concentration creates gravity. This is where the simple tax story starts to break down. Because if someone built their fortune inside a dense ecosystem of bankers, founders, clients, political connections, legal infrastructure, and media influence, then moving somewhere cheaper may save money on paper while costing them something much more valuable in practice: proximity. And proximity matters more than people realize. A hedge fund manager can technically move, but if the deals, the relationships, and the prestige are all tied to one city, then distance becomes expensive in ways tax calculators do not capture. A business owner can relocate, but if their suppliers, customers, or industry events all orbit one region, leaving might reduce tax costs while quietly damaging growth. This is why a lot of tax migration stories look much cleaner in headlines than they do in real life. It is easy to say, why not just move to a lower tax state? It is much harder to rebuild an entire local network of trust, credibility, and access. And for many wealthy people, that network is not a side detail. It is the asset. A rich person may own stocks, real estate, and businesses, but they also own something harder to measure: position. Position inside the right room, the right city, the right phone book, the right social layer. And often, that position is worth more than the extra percentage point they're trying to avoid, which leads to an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the people who threaten to leave are not always telling you what they will do. Maybe they are telling you what gives them leverage. And that brings us to the psychology of the threat itself. Because saying, "I'll leave," is not just a plan. Sometimes it is a negotiation tactic. People with money understand something very well. Fear is persuasive. If you can make politicians, journalists, or local voters believe that your departure will damage the economy, you gain power without ever packing a suitcase. This does not mean every wealthy person who talks about leaving is bluffing. Some do leave. But the threat itself has value, even when the move never happens. Think about how often the story appears. Every time taxes rise, every time regulations tighten, every time governments talk about stronger enforcement, a familiar warning appears almost immediately. Investment will dry up, talent will disappear, business will flee, the city will be punished. That message works because it taps into a deep insecurity modern societies already have. We are constantly told that growth is fragile, that capital is nervous, that money can run at any moment, and that ordinary people should be grateful it stays at all. That is not just economics. That is psychology. It turns tax policy into emotional blackmail. It frames the wealthy as permanently mobile and everyone else as permanently dependent. And over time, that changes the way societies think about power. Instead of asking, "What kind of tax system is fair?" people start asking, "How much can we ask for before they punish us?" That shift is huge. Because once fear becomes the center of the conversation, policy stops being designed around public goals and starts being designed around investor mood. The wealthy no longer need to physically leave in large numbers. They only need to make staying feel conditional. And when a society starts organizing itself around the fear of upsetting capital, it does not just change tax policy. It changes who is really in charge. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting. Even when wealthy people do move, they are not all the same kind of mover. Some are highly mobile global asset owners. These are people who already treat countries the way other people treat bank accounts. Their attachment to place is weak. Their money is international. Their lifestyle is portable. If a better deal appears somewhere else, they can go. But that group is not the same as the entire wealthy population. A successful surgeon, a founder, a top lawyer, a senior engineer, or a specialist investor may have a high income, but their life is often deeply rooted in local institutions. Their qualifications, clients, staff, reputation, and social world are tied to one place. In other words, they may be rich, but they are not weightless. That distinction changes how we think about tax flight. If a billionaire with no local attachment moves because another country gives them a softer landing, that tells us something. But if a city starts losing doctors, engineers, researchers, and builders, that tells us something much bigger. One is about asset mobility. The other is about institutional decay, and the economic consequences are completely different. Money can be moved, it can also be replaced, reallocated, taxed differently, or invested elsewhere. But skilled people are harder to replace. A city cannot simply print more experienced surgeons, startup operators, or high-level teachers. A country cannot rebuild trust in its institutions overnight after talent leaves. So when people say, "We have to keep the rich happy or they'll go," the question should be, which rich people are we talking about? Because a society built around pleasing globally mobile wealth may end up neglecting the very people who actually make the place productive, functional, and worth living in. This is why the places that hold on to wealth over time usually offer more than low taxes. They offer opportunity, stability, infrastructure, and belonging. That combination matters more than people admit. A wealthy person may save money by moving, but they also compare schools, healthcare, legal protection, time zone convenience, travel access, social status, culture, safety, and whether the place they move to actually feels like somewhere they want to live. And for many, the answer is more emotional than economic. People do not like to say that because it sounds less rational. But the truth is, identity often outweighs optimization. A person may complain about taxes in California while still wanting California weather, California networks, California customers, and California cultural prestige. A financier may hate paying more in New York while still wanting the attention, access, and influence that New York provides. A wealthy family may like the tax deal in another country, but not enough to rebuild their life there from scratch. And that should not be surprising. Most people at every income level want the same deep things: familiarity, status, convenience, security, and a feeling that they belong where they are. The real question then is not whether taxes matter. It is whether taxes matter enough to overpower everything else. Sometimes they do. Often they do not. And once we admit that, the public conversation becomes healthier. We stop treating every tax discussion like a hostage situation. We stop assuming that the wealthiest people are always one bill away from disappearing. And we start asking a better question: what kind of place are we building? And who is it actually built for? So, what should ordinary people take from all of this? First, be careful with economic stories that sound too simple, especially when they are repeated by people who benefit from them. Raise taxes and the rich will leave sounds clean, but real life is messy. Human beings do not make major life decisions based on one variable, not even wealthy human beings. Second, money has psychology attached to it. That is true for struggling households, and it is true for the rich. People do not just protect wealth, they protect status, comfort, control, identity, and access. Once you understand that, a lot of public economic behavior starts making more sense. And third, there is a difference between attracting money and building a healthy economy. A place can become very good at welcoming wealth without becoming a better place to live for everyone else. In fact, sometimes the opposite happens. Housing gets more expensive. Public priorities get distorted. Local workers get squeezed. And the whole city starts feeling like it is serving capital first and ordinary life second. That is why this topic matters so much beyond taxes. It is really about power, about who gets to shape policy, about whether societies should constantly lower their standards to keep a handful of high net worth people comfortable, and about whether we have quietly accepted a system where the fear of losing wealth matters more than the daily reality of the people who actually keep a place running. Once you look at it that way, the discussion changes. It is no longer, how do we stop the rich from leaving? It becomes, why are we so afraid of asking what fair contribution looks like in the first place? So no, rich people are not trapped. Some do leave. Some really do move for taxes. Some move because the numbers make sense. But the larger story is not that the wealthy are endlessly mobile and everyone else just has to accept it. The larger story is that wealth, like everyone else, is shaped by attachment, opportunity, psychology, and power. And that matters, because once you stop believing the myth that money always runs the second taxes rise, you can start asking much better questions. Not just how to keep wealth nearby, but how to build places where prosperity is real, institutions are strong, and ordinary people do not have to live inside a permanent threat that capital might punish them for asking too much. Maybe the most important lesson here is that the richest people in society are not floating above human nature. They are still human. They still care about access, habit, identity, family, status, and belonging. Which means the debate was never just about tax rates. It was about who gets to define what a society can ask for. If this made you see the story differently, subscribe to Money Patterns, because the deeper patterns behind money are usually hiding in plain sight.